Hello, everyone, and we continue our Introduction to Personality Theory course of lectures. And today we start to investigate and learn about the new domain in personality psychology. It is biological domain. So let's discuss our agenda for next two lectures. So it will be clear what we will be discussing. So first of all, we should discuss biological domain in general to provide you with general overview. And then we will dive into specific topics related to this research orientation in personality psychology. We will talk about personality and genetical factors, including behavioral genetics and its findings. And then we will transit to physiological approaches to personality, and we will discuss several physiology-based theories of personality. After that, we will have an obvious conclusion. So let's start with a general overview of the biological domain. So biological domain refers to those physical elements and biological systems within our bodies that influence or are influenced by our behavior, thoughts, and feelings. So it's not a secret that all people have their body, right? Including their nervous system and genetics. So, and both factors, physiological and genetical, significantly influence the way how we behave, how we think, and how we feel. And some researchers suppose that biological factors are primary factors which influence your personality. And the idea is that we should study those biological factors as the primary factors which influence your personality to understand psychological variables, for example, personality traits we discussed in dispositional domain. So two most important areas of research here in the biological domain are genes and brain and nervous system. In this lecture, we will focus on genetical factors, and in next lecture, we will talk about nervous system and physiological theories of personality. So physiological factors do not always cause personality difference, but often correlate with it. So it should be considered not always as a cause behind some psychological effects, but rather a different language to describe what is happening. For example, on internal mental level, you feel aggressive toward a certain person, but we also can describe it not in terms of your internal emotions and external behaviors, but also in terms of your physiological reactions, which coincide in time, correlate with your internal feelings, and genetical predispositions to being more and less aggressive toward different people. So this is the idea of biological domains, that we not always find a cause of personality difference, but we always can describe what correlates with the personality differences. So psychologists now considering evidence for the evolution of physiological characteristics as well. So they start to use evolutionary psychology and evolutionary physiology to understand the difference in physiological characteristics people currently have. So it's a very promising area of research, also connected to biological domain of personality psychology, which we will discuss a bit later in our classes. So if we talk about genetical factors and personality, we should start with some facts and basic concepts of genetics before we will transit to behavioral genetics, which is already an interdisciplinary field between psychology and genetics. So first of all, the concept of genome. So it refers to complete set of genes an organism possesses. The human genome contains between 20,000 and 30,000 genes. So it's a wide range, but still we have estimation for that. The Human Genome Project was a multi-billion-dollar research which was started in June 2000, so 24 years ago. It's quite a long story. The task was to create the whole book of all genes people have. So it was a big research project with a lot of funding, as we said previously, and many genetics specialists and professors collaborated on this project, including work of different laboratories all over the world. So, and after that, they came to very interesting conclusions, including the whole list of genes people have. So, throughout this project, scientists got a lot of insight about how human genetics works. So, one of the findings was actually very interesting. The idea that not only the number of genes important, but also the manner in which genes are decoded into proteins. So the funny fact is that people have approximately the same amount of genes as mice or worms, but we are very different from mice and worms, right? So not only the number of genes is important, as I said before, the manner in which human genes get decoded into proteins, very different. It's far more variable than in other species. So our genes allow us to decode, to be decoded into proteins in much more different ways compared to other species like mice and worms we mentioned before. So it's a huge deal. These alternative forms of decoding create variety of proteins, many more than we see in other species. And probably it may be the reason behind why we have such a complex differences between, for example, rodents and humans, right? We both are like mammal species, but the difference is tremendous. Also, we have two types of genes. If we roughly divide them into two groups, they're not equal in size. So there are protein coding genes and non-coding genes. Protein coding genes making up only 2% of human genome, so it's just disproportionately small compared to the share of non-coding DNA, but it doesn't mean that they're more important. Previously, scientists thought that those 2% of protein coding genes are important, and the rest of DNA is kind of genetic junk. But later studies showed that it's not true. This is not based on the facts. And those 98% of non-coding genes potentially affect many personality and physical characteristics we might have, and play also very important role in our heritability. So we shouldn't consider those no-coding genes as not important. They just have different functions compared to protein coding genes. So it was a misconception from early geneticists. The problem of studying genetics is mostly ethical. So it's a complex field, right? So if we try to explain the differences in personality traits, which are caused by genetic or environmental differences, we obviously start to think about ethical implications of such a research. So, and many people, including scientists, journalists, political activists, and politicians, worried that findings from behavioral genetics could be used or misused to support different political agendas, right? So because research results might be used to justify some bad, unproductive, or unjust social practices based on discrimination, right? So, and maybe the most simple example of how genetical findings were misused in political aspect is eugenics. So initially, eugenics was developed by Francis Galton, a British scholar. He is a cousin of Charles Darwin, the founder of the theory of evolution. So his initial idea was to breed genetically special people with each other. So Galton conducted a lot of research on heritability, and he came to the conclusion that more smart and beautiful parents have more smart and more beautiful children, and more successful as well. And his idea was, what if we will start to breed those successful, smart, and beautiful people together, so their offspring will be even more beautiful, smart, and successful, and thus we will make a new quality of people. So of course it sounds unethical, right? So because we don't breed people the same way as we breed horses or dogs, right? So this idea from the beginning was a bit off, let's say that. So, but later, these ideas of positive genetics, so-called positive genetics, it's positive because we're trying to multiply good genetical qualities, was used by Nazi Germany as a justification of exterminating people, which they considered as genetically inferior. So probably if you know history of 20th century, you've heard about Nazi Germany and their understanding of genetics. So Nazis were completely sure that some nations are genetically superior to others, and their idea was, if we exterminate all people with bad genetics, as they considered that, only people with good genetics will stay and will have offspring, which will result in improving human species. So the overall idea was that. Of course, it led to a lot of atrocities, and we know about all the Nazis' crimes. Dozens of millions of people died during World War II and before that in concentration camps and as a result of military actions started by Nazi Germany. So it's one of the most drastic examples how presumably genetical findings resulted in a very wrong political agenda. The interesting thing is that Nazi actually tried to justify this as a science, but from the beginning it was a pseudoscience. So there was no evidence, and we don't have it right now as well, that some races or nations are genetically superior to others. So from the beginning, it was simply not true. But a lot of German scientists were either in fear of political regime in Nazi Germany or were bribed. And they advocated that, yes, it's true. And a lot of just common people believe that it's scientifically proven, but it's not. So it's an example of how those ideas can be misused. So again, many people supported this like 80 years ago. So, and we actually don't have any evidence that in modern world it couldn't repeat itself. So we should be very cautious towards such a political agenda and its justification, because a lot of findings in genetics and behavioral genetics can be significantly misinterpreted and used in these very unjust purposes. Behavioral genetics is a bit different from just genetics. So behavioral genetics is a field, interdisciplinary field on the intersection between psychology and genetics. So the difference is that behavioral geneticists are interested in only psychological characteristics whereas just usual geneticists are interested in manifestation and heritability of all characteristics. For example, your eye color and height would be interesting aspects to research for regular geneticists, but not significant for behavioral geneticists because it's not connected with your mental activity and personality. So behavioral genetics basically has several main goals. So first of all, to determine the percentage of individual differences in a trait that can be attributed to genetic differences and percentage that can be attributed to environmental differences. We will discuss this in a bit more detail after considering all goals of behavioral genetics. The second goal is to determine the ways in which genes and environment interact and correlate with each other to produce individual differences. And finally, the third main goal of behavioral genetics is to determine precisely where in the environment environmental effects exist. So, for example, is it parental socialization? Is it influence of different teachers? Or it's books which affects us, or like television or YouTube channels, for example, right? So we need to determine all three ways. So again, percentage of individual differences that are attributed to genetic and environmental factors, the ways how genes and environment interact and correlate, and finally, precisely determine which environmental factors influence this difference. So the key concepts of behavioral genetics you need to know to understand its findings. First is heritability. It's just a statistics that refers to the proportion of observed variance in a group of individuals that can be accounted by genetic variance. All right, so again, it's a statistic estimation of the proportion of observed variance in a group of individuals that can be accounted to genetic variance. So it's important that it's a statistical measure. So heritability is just as a proportion of phenotypic variance that is attributable to genotypic variance. And phenotypic variance, as a new concept introduced here, refers to observed individual differences, such as in height, weight, or personality, what we can observe. Genotypic variance refers to individual differences in the total collection of genes possessed by each person. So again, genotype and phenotype, two different concepts. Genotype is what genes you have, and phenotype is how they're manifested externally, so what you can observe, right? The relationships between phenotype and genotype can be complex. So sometimes people have certain genes, but they not manifested that clearly, and only based on appearance, you cannot make conclusions about genes people have, right? So it's not the same. Please be attentive to this difference. The percentage of observed variance in a group of individuals that can be attributed to environmental differences is called environmentality, right? So heritability and environmentality. If we have group of people and they have differences, right? What proportion of this variance can be attributed to genetical variance, heritability, or environmental factors, environmentality? Heritability cannot be applied to a single individual. So if you see one single person, you never can know why this person look and behaves like that. Is it genetical or environmental? Why? Because in his or her personal history, all those factors already intertwined, and you basically don't know why it happened. For example, on the screen, you can see an obvious difference in height between famous actor Danny DeVito and famous basketball player LeBron James. They have more than 60 centimeters of height difference. So why it happens so, right? So it's harder to determine. Zoo height is a bit more simple example. We know that height mostly depends on genetics and has a small environmental factor such as nutrition. So, but in modern world, especially in the United States, a wealthy country, mostly all people have a proper nutrition. So we can make a conjecture that the difference between LeBron James and Danny DeVito is mostly due to genetical factors. But again, we cannot provide any clear estimation statistics, which percent goes where. So heritability is this statistics that applies only to population, so big groups of people, and only at one point of time and environment. The thing is that genetical pool of people is different. So if we compare, for example, genetical pool of people living in Canada right now, it would be different from genetical pool of people who lived in Canada 100 years ago. It's not like completely different, right? But it's different. It's different. So we didn't become a new species developing new adaptations, of course. 100 years is not enough for that. But the overall genetical pool now is different, and in 50 years it also will be different. So heritability refers to what happens right now in the environmental setting we research. So it's not an exact number which never will change. And you need to understand that when you read the research into the field of behavioral genetics, because you should be critical to numbers and heritability statistics it provides. Heritability is best regarded merely as an estimate of the percentage of phenotypic differences due to genetic differences. It's not precise, as I said before, so please be careful with this metric. Which brings us to so-called nature-nurture debate. It's a classical debate in psychology, which actually originated earlier in philosophy. So usually when we speak about nature-nurture debate, we mean by nature our genetics, our personality and abilities which are in our nature. You cannot change your genetics, you just have it from the moment of birth. But nurture is our environment and how we nurture our children, upbringing and life experiences and education. And for many centuries, people argued what is more important. If a person is a good person, talented and hardworking, is it because of like special genetics they had from their parents, or it's a matter of upbringing? Or if a person, a bad person, for example, a criminal, is it because of poor nurturing conditions, or it's genetical predisposition which we cannot change? Obviously, the result of such debates is crucially important for implementing different social practices, right? Imagine if tomorrow we will learn that being a criminal is 90% genetical. So it doesn't matter that much how you upbring children. Some of them just will become criminals no matter what. So it doesn't depend on schools and parents and TV and YouTube channels they watch. They just will become that. It will change the whole society, I'm not sure for the better, because those genes will be probably tracked and those people will be closely monitored and suspected in all the crime, which will make a completely different judicial system. On the other hand, if we will learn, for example, the opposite, that some people prone to crime only because of nurture, like 95%, it implies that the genetic factors are not important And all of responsibility for someone who committed a crime is like parents, schools, and social policies responsibility. And it will create, again, a completely different educational or social environment. So those implications of how we resolve those debates are very important in terms of how we implement that in social practice. And that's why it's also connected with ethical issues, right? So, and here, what is important, at the level of individual, nor nature-nurture debate is not existent. Again, because a single individual is unique, and those factors intertwine so closely, we cannot distinguish why that exact person is acting that specific way. Is it because of genetics or because of nurture and breeding? So in this sense, nature and nurture debate exists only at the level of population. However, we can disentangle the influence of genes and environments. This is a level of analysis at which behavioral genetics can operate. So when you hear those debates and heritability estimations, again, it's not applicable to one single person, because on the level of one single individual, we cannot understand what was genetical and what was environmental. So all these discussions in behavioral genetics as well are making any sense only at the level of population. Please be careful with that. Please be attentive of this division, because it's counterintuitive, and many people who didn't study psychology actually think about exact people they know and provide them as an example. But again, if we speak about one single person, individual, we cannot distinguish genetical and environmental factors. Behavioral geneticists usually utilize four main methods. It's not the whole list of methods of behavioral genetics, but most of the research articles you might find in this area usually utilize 1, 2, 3, or all four of aforementioned methods. So the first one is selective breeding with animals. So a lot of behavioral genetics research is done not on humans, not on people, but rather on different animal species. You can breed them. For example, like we breed dogs, horses, cows, cats, creating different breeds of them and cultivating different psychological and physical characteristics. And because of that, we can research how those characteristics are inherited and how it's connected to the genetics of parents. So the genetic of offspring is connected to genetic of their parents. So it's very interesting and provides a lot of insight, but of course it's obvious, but I should say that it's unethical to conduct this on people. We cannot force to reproduce certain people because we're just interested how their children will look like and how they will behave, right? We don't do that. So it could provide a lot of interesting research information, obviously, but it's completely unethical. So we will never see such a research results in any scientific article. So that's why if we speak about research done on people, on humans, behavioral geneticists usually use one of three methods listed here. First is family studies. So we basically take a family of people, different generations of the family, and try to like research what they share in common and in which ways they are different. So again, you have family members as well, highly likely. So you might think what you share in common with your parents and grandparents, if you have them, and in which ways you're different. And again, people in a single family actually share a lot of in common, but they also might be very different, even if we speak about like siblings. They literally have the same parents, but they have very different personality very often, right? So it can provide us with some heritability estimation. So this method is interesting. We usually, if we see a lot of in common between different generations of a family, we start to put forward hypothesis that it's probably genetical, right? The problem is that it violates equal environments assumption. So different members of one family do not have equal environment. So they obviously have different jobs, they studied at different places, and they have different friends, and they watch different, I don't know, YouTube channels, and they subscribe to different communities on social networks, and so on. So in this case, it's really hard to determine what is the proportion of environmentality and which exact factors of environment are more important. So that's why most of behavioral genetics researchers use twin studies more often. So I will quickly remind you that we could have possibly two types of twins, identical twins which share 100% of genes, so they genetically fully identical, right? In this case, if we see any difference between genetically identical twins, we can attribute it to environmental differences. It's clear because if they have the same genetical pool, exactly the same, all the difference is only due to environment, right? But we also have dizygotic twins, so just twins who share 50% of genome. So they basically is just regular siblings was born at the same time. In this sense, if we see difference between them, it might be not due to environment, but also due to genetics. So comparing dizygotic and monozygotic twins, identical twins, can provide us with a lot of interesting insight on how different personality characteristics might be inherited and what's the role of environmentality. The problem again is that even twins who was born at the same time do not have like absolutely equal environment, right? So sometimes parents treat children differently. They might also attend different classes and different schools, right? It also happens. They might have different toys and different friends, and this will affect them. So in these cases, it's much harder to provide estimation of role of environmentality. And again, what exact type of environmental influence is important. Adoption studies based on like almost opposite idea. So if we speak about adopted children, they have 0 shared genes with their parents. So if adopted children start to be similar to their parents, it's 100% due to environmental factors, right? Because they don't have any shared genes. And it's interesting for research as well to study environmentality. So in this case, heritability is just absent, so we know that it's not true. But if we involve their biological parents into research, we also can get an estimation of heritability. So if adopted children live with their new parents, but still behave the same way as their biological parents, probably is due to genetical factors, right? So it's very clear. So the problem with this type of research is that it's very hard to find participants for such type of research. It's quite rare. And adopted kids and people who adopt kids might be not very representative to overall population. Again, so not all people ready to adopt children, right? Usually it's specific type of people with more altruistic motivation, more empathetic, thinking about and caring about other people, right? So not all people so altruistic to do that nice thing as adopting children. And children who get adopted also usually come from very specific families, because usually people don't give their children, right? So it's not a typical common situation which we encounter all the time. So both children and both parents can be very specific. And in this sense, the results of the study cannot be easily generalized on the overall population of people. So usually, if you will take any research article in behavioral genetics, usually it utilizes at least one of aforementioned methods, but it's again not a full list. It's only like a small introduction to how it might look like. So if we will discuss the findings of behavioral genetics, I think the most rational point is to start with the big 5 personality traits. So very popular theory from dispositional domain of personality. A quick reminder, this theory implies that all people all over the world from different societies and different cultures, their personality can be described in terms of only 5 personality traits, which are extroversion, introversion, the first trait, neuroticism, emotional stability, the second trait, agreeableness as a third trait, conscientiousness, impulsivity as a fourth trait, and openness to new experience versus conservatism is a fifth factor. So most commonly studied personality traits are extroversion and neuroticism, because initially psychologists and behavioral geneticists believed that those traits are more heritable compared to others. So summaries of many research in behavioral genetics show that heritability estimation for these 5 personality traits is about 50%. So 50% of variance in those traits between groups of people can be attributed to genetical factors and 50% due to environmental factors. So 50% is actually a moderate heritability. So a lot of things depends on genetical factors, but 50% of environmentality also shows that like nurturing, upbringing, education, psychotherapy, and all other environmental factors also very important in your ontogenesis. So recent meta-analysis done in 2015 identified that average heritability is around 48%, right? So 52 for environmentality, around 50. Genetical factors influence a bit different other personality characteristics, for example, attitudes and preferences. So here, everything is very different. So there is a huge variance in heritability of attitudes. Some of them show very interesting results. For example, traditionalism as an attitude shows high heritability, around 60%, right? More than for the big 5. But being religious, for example, shows no heritability at all. So your religious views not connected with your genetics, but your political views are connected. For me, for example, it was an unexpected result when I studied all those differences. So it's actually quite intriguing why it happens. So behavioral genetics conducts this type of research, and I think more interesting results are coming. So be attentive to this field. Not clear. For now, it's not very clear why some attitudes appear to be highly heritable, while others not. So research of heritability in sexual orientation, another very important social issue right now for many countries, is also developing area. So currently, evidence suggests that genes provide modest and indirect influence through childhood experiences on adult sexual orientation. What we know for sure is that sexual orientation is not a matter of choice. So people cannot change their sexual orientation on purpose, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's like completely genetical. So again, current studies we have provide us with modest and indirect genetical influence. And I think in upcoming years, we will receive more and more interesting data because behavioral genetics field advances very fast. So each year, each 5 years, a lot of changes. So again, please be attentive to this field. We will get a lot of interesting results, which might change all the understanding and all the theories we had about, for example, sexuality and gender as well. Drinking and smoking show connection with several personality characteristics, such as sensation seeking, extraversion, and neuroticism. So people who seek sensations usually willing to take more risks to feel something new, get new impressions. So people who high on sensation seeking more often drink and smoke. People with higher neuroticism drink and smoke because of anxiety, and they often try to reduce their negative affect, negative feelings through those habits. And people who high on extroversion might be more active, and it also might be connected with sensation seeking. So they usually might be more prone to drinking and smoking as well. So both drinking alcohol and smoking cigarettes, at least very stable over time and show evidence of heritability. So and actually, it corresponds with a lot of observations. So if your parents smoked or have problems with alcohol abuse, you might inherit those problems. So we see that it runs in families. And now we know that it's also connected with genetical predispositions. So people who have this genetical predisposition should be more careful and mindful of their behavior because it's important for their health and well-being. Marriage. Behavioral geneticists also tried to research marriage, and they got quite a surprising findings. So first of all, the whole idea, will you marry someone or not, shows very high heritability of 68%. So some people do not marry at all during their lifetime, and probably they're genetically different compared to people who eventually marry. It's very interesting, surprising result. Initially, I suppose that it has no connection with genetics at all, and it's always a matter of life choice. But now we know that might be actually quite heritable. Satisfaction of marriage is also connected to genetics, which is interesting. It's 50% depends on genes for women, and even more interesting finding that personality qualities, traits of wife, such as optimism, emotional warmth, and low aggressiveness, correlated with higher marriage satisfaction for both wife and husband. Actually, quite an interesting story. Though we should interpret this very, very carefully because there might be flaws in research design and it's connected to our social orientation and views on gender, and current social situation with the social institute of marriage. So I won't be surprised if new, more recent studies will show different results due to different research orientation of behavioral geneticists and psychologists. So we should be careful with it. But for now, those findings actually seem quite surprising. Now we need to talk about environment, right? So we should distinguish shared and non-shared environmental influences. So we're trying to be more detailed if we describe environment. So shared environment in family features is what siblings have in common. For example, number of books at home or salary of their parents. So no matter how many children is in family, they have something in common in terms of like their apartment and access to different things, such as books at home, number of personal computers, or money. But there is a huge chunk of non-shared environmental influences. For example, different siblings can have different friends, and they can have different school teachers because they study in different classes or even different schools. And it's an important environmental influence, right? So your social connections and your education shape you in many aspects. So in this sense, most of the environment siblings have is probably non-shared environment, right? Even if they have the same parents and they live in the same apartment or, I don't know, detached house, they still have a huge proportion of non-shared environmental influence. And we need to take this to account when we conduct research in behavioral genetics about personality. So personality characteristics show heritabilities in the range of 40, 50, 60%, as we discussed before, showing thus substantial degree of environmentality, right? So it's almost equal to heritability. So the most personality variables the shared environment has either little or no impact. So research shows that for personality variables, again, most of personality variables, shared environment is not important. It's only responsible for 5% variation. Actually a huge result. So, and also surprising, at least it was very surprising for me. So non-shared environment is much more important. But again, it's counterintuitive. So many parents think, oh, what we do with our children is much more important than what happens at schools, for example, or the influence of friends my child has. But actually, this research shows that probably friends of your children might have bigger impact on their personality than you as a parent, which is, like, again, counterintuitive and goes against a lot of cultural stereotypes. But again, we should be very careful with such findings. Again, it's connected to a lot of ethical implications we should be mindful of. So I won't be surprised if we'll get a bit different clarified results on this matter in upcoming years. So most environmental causes appear to stem from the aspect of environment siblings experience differently, as I said. So we should be mindful of that. Genes in the environment. More complex forms of behavioral genetics analysis involve the concepts of genotype-environment interaction and genotype-environment correlation. So what it is about? Genotype-environment interaction refers to the differential response of individuals with different genotypes to the same environment, right? So, for example, we have the same personality psychology course, right? But we have different students enrolled in this course, and those students have different genetics. So environment is the same, but your response to this course will be different, right? Also due to your genetical differences. It's genotype-environment interaction. Genotype-environment correlation, on the other hand, is the differential exposure of individuals with different genotypes to different environments, right? So different people, different settings. Also, all students who listen to this lecture have different environments. For example, different job places, different courses you enrolled in, except personality, introduction to personality theory, different family settings, different friends settings, right? So you exposed to those settings, it's genotype environment correlation. Three different genotype environment correlation types. So this second genotype environment correlation have different aspects. So first of all, you need to be aware of passive genotype environment correlation. It happens when parents provide both genes and environment to their children, and children do nothing to obtain that environment, right? So they don't have any impact on the situation. For example, child's verbal ability or number of books in home. So obviously, when children are born, they're not responsible for buying books and creating surroundings around them. So it's fully parents' influence. And thus, a child is passive, right? Fully passive. And parents, both responsible for genes they gave to their children and environment they create for children, right? So in this sense, a child is passive, thus it's called passive genotype environment correlation. Reactive genotype environment correlation is a bit different. It happens when parents or other people respond to children differently, depends on child genotypes. For example, twins were born, one twin likes to be cuddled, like responds positively, laughs, and like almost invites to parents to cuddle him or her, and another twin don't like that. So when you try to cuddle, this child starts to cry, resists, and obviously shows that he or she doesn't like that. So in this case, parents probably will cuddle a lot the first child and will stop cuddle the second child, right? So child partially influences the situation, and parents respond to this like genetical predisposition differently. So it creates this reactive genotype environment correlation. But finally, there is also an active genotype environment correlation. It happens when a person with particular genotype creates actively and seeks actively particular environment. So, for example, some children have higher need for new experiences, they high sensation seekers, and they start to be involved in more risky behavior. For example, at the playground or with their friends, they start more dangerous activities, while children with low sensation seeking might be playing very carefully or reading books, and they don't show any interest in involving in the dangerous or risky types of activities. So they start to create different environment for themselves as a matter of their personal choice and preference, right? So they might choose different things to do with their spare time, for example, which creates different environment and thus influence their personality. So it's active genotype environment correlation concept. So all these types of genotype-environment correlations can be positive or negative. So in this sense, environment can encourage the expression of certain personality traits and dispositions, or may discourage its expression. For example, some people are more extroverted and sociable than others, while some people more introverted. Imagine a situation where when extroverted parents who are very sociable and gregarious and active have an introverted child, right? So extroverted parents want to communicate more often. They invite more guests and go to different social gatherings and meetings very often, but their child probably do not respond very well to that because they don't like that. But parents probably might push their child more and more in those types of activities and thus discourage the expression of introversion trait, right? Because they, for example, don't appreciate that. They suppose that people should be more sociable and more active. This is a virtue. You shouldn't stay home, play alone. It's not okay, right? So parents discourage the expression of this trait. Or imagine a different situation. A child is born with extroversion and they have extroverted parents. And parents encourage this extroversion, saying, oh, yes, it's great, you should do that more often, be more active, be more sociable, be more talkative, be more persistent, right? And the same personality trait as extroversion now is encouraged to be expressed, right? It creates very different environmental settings. So for all people, some of our personality traits were encouraged to express by our parents, school teachers, friends and society. But some of our personality traits might be discouraged to express in our social group or our culture, for example. So it's important in which environment you live in because it might encourage or discourage those genotype environment correlations. And finally, I wanted to share with you an interesting results from molecular genetics. So it's the newest field in genetics connected with huge advancements we have in technology. So molecular genetics methods designed to identify specific genes associated with personality traits. So nowadays we not only able to say, oh, it 50% depends on that and 50% depends on that. Sometimes we can identify the exact genes responsible for manifestation of certain personality traits. Though it seems very complicated because in people, most of personality traits are so-called polygenetic. So the manifestation of this trait depends on several dozens and sometimes hundreds of genes. But in some cases, everything might be more simple. One example is this sensation-seeking behavior. So research found the exact gene which is connected with more gambling, for example, in men. So we know a specific gene from genome, which is called DRD4, and this gene is probably responsible for more risky financial behavior in men, right? It's fascinating results. So molecular genetics will be developing very fast in upcoming years. So again, as I said multiple times during this lecture, please be attentive to this field. We will receive a lot of very interesting, fascinating, and surprising results about personality and genetical factors in upcoming years. So in next video, we will discuss physiological factors which influence personality or correlate with personality, and we will discuss physiology-based series of personality. Thank you.